Welcome back. This is week 12, lecture 1, postmodernism. Now, if you are listening to this lecture, the idea anyway is that you have submitted midterm 2. And so this is really getting towards the last section of the course. There's only a couple weeks left. And what we're looking at now is the transition from the modern paradigm to what replaces it. If we look at the general sweep of the development of Western civilization, which is what we've been doing in this course, what we've seen is the transformation and transition from medieval Christendom, in the medieval paradigm, let's say, to, first of all, early modern Europe and the myth of the nation state, as I refer to it. And then we come to the transition from early modern Europe to modern Europe, which is basically the age of revolutions, with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and on we go. Because scholars have seen a similarity between early modern and modern, even though early modern is not quite modern. Now, the whole problem with the term modernity is it is a relative term that has a reference to the present. The term modern was also used in the Middle Ages. The moderns and the ancients, the moderni and the antiqui. Modern is what is now, the most recent. And so we have this problem of what is modern is always changing. And then historians come along and describe large-scale historical developments and patterns, and then, as I have said before, what Hans Kung, sorry, I can't even think. Scientific revolutions, Kuhn, Thomas Kuhn. The paradigms, and a paradigm is kind of like how I use the word myth, is broad intellectual, cultural, social, political understandings of the way the world works. And these broad paradigms are very slow to change, and we see transition periods. We can't really point to any one time when all of a sudden there is this kind of the door opens and then it closes, and that's that. We're now in a new paradigm. It is a process. Just like we can say in 1300, Europe was definitely medieval. In 1600, it's definitely early modern. When does the change take place, and how does it change take place? Just like we can say, okay, in 1700, Europe is still early modern. In 1850, it is now changed sufficiently that we need to refer to it as modernity. The question is then, what happens after modernity? And I think I've said this before, but in my view, we are currently, and have been for quite a while, in one of these transition phases where the new paradigm has not yet been established or set. The old paradigm of modernity has been crumbling. I talked about the crumbling of Christendom, I think, in one of my lectures early on. But what we see is it's breaking apart. There are cracks and fissures, and like, no, this is no really longer modern. What is it? That's where we come up with postmodern. Now, postmodernity originally was a literary term. Modern literature was a novel. And if you look at the slides for this lecture, I'm not going to be talking about literature today. We'll be talking about art, but not literature. And you can ask, why not? And it's like, well, first of all, I don't know that much about the history of English literature, to be quite honest. But the modern paradigm, postmodernity, from this literary critical term to philosophy, I know more about that, so we'll be talking a little bit about that today, to then general cultural structures. If we look at the modernity and what became the modern paradigm, it was based on the ideals of the Enlightenment, the individual, rational, autonomous individual who can think for themselves, who are rational, and based on reason, we can understand everything that we experience, everything that we observe in the world. It all should make sense. It's also based then on the nation state, which of course was an early modern development, but becomes more prevalent in the course of the 19th century is based on industrialization and capitalism. And we saw Adam Smith, which is an Enlightenment thinker, who provided the theory of this laissez-faire capitalism, industrialization, and then how do we handle all of these things? It's also based on a Newtonian universe, because Newton, who really kind of helped set the new paradigm of early modernity, his physical theses of the physical world and his laws was a very mechanical and rational approach. That the world functions and the universe functions according to natural laws that we can understand. Now, natural law was a concept in the Middle Ages, and I think I've talked about the scientific revolution and the medieval origins thereof, and some of the basic principles being the same, whereby if there had not been the developments in medieval science, there probably could not have been the scientific revolution, because in some ways they're doing the same things. They're just seeing more, discovering more. That's why Galileo is so important. And their concepts are changing. Now, obviously, there's a process we can call broadly, even though I don't like the term, secularization, because there is a degree to which in early modernity, religion and theology become more individualized. It becomes more of a choice. Whereas in medieval Christendom, it is basically state policy. Now, we can't refer to the Middle Ages as a theocracy in any real sense. Okay? The idea that everyone just followed the Pope and the Pope was in charge and whatever the Pope said went is complete fallacy and completely ahistorical. Okay? There was fights all along. I mean, Marsilius of Padua in 1324 argued that the papacy should be abolished. That's before 200 years before Luther and this quote-unquote Reformation. Kings and princes were in competition with the Pope, fighting with the Pope. So there's all kinds of conflicts, even within the basic structure, because within medieval Christendom is always who was really in charge. Was it the Pope or the Emperor? Either way, there's still all kinds of conflicts. So it was not a univocal approach. Okay. But as we move into early modernity, after the religious wars, after all the conflict and turmoil brought about by, quote unquote, the Reformation, it began to be a sense of, okay, we need to realize that it's not really worth killing people over belief. Now, that was not a position that was even thought of in the Middle Ages. In an early modern period, it still was not really a majority opinion. And when we think of Thomas Hobbes, for example, in English absolutism, as I talked about it, Hobbes said, you can believe what you want, even though you still have to conform to the state religion. Absolutism of Louis XIV, divine right of kings, which was a medieval concept, was saying, I am the state, and very much a Catholic state. So what we see with the Enlightenment then becomes, I said, talk about secularization, this period where we have the emergence of atheism. Now, the term atheism had been around all along. The Christians were considered atheists by the Romans because they did not believe in the gods. And atheism means without gods. They just believed in one God. They were atheists. Now, it was always an outgroup term. It was a term you used to attack your opponents. Whereas in the late 17th century, we begin to see people who say, I am an atheist. That does not mean that everybody in the Enlightenment were atheists. The issue is, again, almost three positions. A Christian position, a theistic or a deistic position, meaning there is God, and then an atheistic position. And many of the thinkers of the Enlightenment were deists. They weren't necessarily traditional Christians. They were deists. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. Benjamin Franklin was a deist. And based on reason and the Enlightenment. But there were people who were beginning to say, I'm not just a deist, I'm an atheist. And as intellectual development continued into the 19th century with the emergence of Darwinism, undermining the concept of the uniqueness of human beings. In some ways, I could have pointed to Darwin as part of postmodernity, because Darwin starts to chip away at that. And what we'll see today is a number of different developments from the later 19th century on until the mid 20th century or so, or even continuing, that not necessarily explicitly, but implicitly challenge and cause to break apart this modern understanding of the world, of the individual, autonomous, rational individual. The natural laws work all by reason and Newtonian physics, that we can understand everything based on Newton. And then a basis of realism, I'll be talking about that, and that we can really understand the world. And that was in the context of then understanding the nation state as part of that rational development. And nationalism is seen as an outgrowth thereof. And we've talked about the issues of nationalism and the problems thereof, especially in the form of popular nationalism, as we saw with Mussolini and with Hitler in Italy. And then we have the whole development of the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution after World War I. That was still based on kind of the concept of nationalism and how do we go about implementing it and forcing it to become a reality. Now, World War I and World War II, too, we can almost see as postmodern wars, because they were wars that were never like the previous wars, which were usually conceived of as army of one country against an army of another country. Now, there's always civilian casualties, damages, everything else, but all of a sudden it went from army against army, or military against military, to society against society. A total war concept. And it was a shock to Europe. So even there, we can consider World War I and World War II to be postmodern wars. Now, that's going too far in some ways. And so here, I'm using the term postmodernism, not in a technical sense, but in a very broad descriptive sense of that which comes after modernity and that which led to the questioning of the modern paradigm. So I hope that's kind of clear. And the problem is, it's not a very felicitous term, postmodern, because it simply means after modernity. We maybe at some point, once we have the new paradigm, might have a new term for it. We don't yet, because then the question is, as history continues to develop, unless the world all comes to an end and we blow each other up, or we get, destroyed by global warming or whatever other catastrophe we have, there'll be further developments after this emerging paradigm of postmodernity. And what will we call that? Will it simply be postmodernity? That's kind of the dilemma we have as scholars, as historians, in terms of interpreting and labeling. Labeling is a problem and an issue, and I've said that before, because when we label something, that all of a sudden affects and informs how we understand it. And we start to take the labels as things themselves, where they're simply descriptive terms of our analysis and interpretation. Now, I could go a lot about that. I've already said more than I had planned, but this is just kind of preparing the overview for this last part of the course and what it is that we're talking about, because in some ways this lecture, Postmodernity, really gets at looking at the developments for this last part of the course as such. We've already gone through 19th century nationalism, Darwinism. I think I mentioned and discussed a bit about. I've even referred to the new physics in the World War I lecture and the World War II lecture, because that was going to be important. We'll be talking about the new physics again today. It's like, wait a minute, what we thought was the case is no longer the case. When we start saying that, when we said what we thought was the way the world worked, seemingly is not the way the world works. Now what? That's the problem with the question. So with that overarching kind of grand view that will be there for the rest of the course. And I'll come back to it in the last lecture as well, kind of trying to sum everything up in terms of the development of Western civilization up until basically the present day. What was going on? What were some of the contributing factors? Now, I'm not going to be talking about all the contributing factors. The textbook does not talk about all the contributing factors. There's more of a political focus of the textbook, and I'll be talking about some of the political developments in some of the other lectures, not so much today. But it is, how do we deal with this, and how do we come to an understanding of what went on and what is going on? So there we go. So much for the introduction and the overview. So today we're going to look specifically at a few areas of that contributed to and that also represent this postmodernity as challenging the Newtonian Enlightenment rational individual concept of modernity. If you look at the different sections here, most of them, not all of them, but most of them have challenging something, challenging the Newtonian universe, challenging the autonomous rational individual, challenging the nation state, challenging language, and then art and representation. I should have said maybe perhaps challenging representation. I should have said art, challenging representation, or something like that. And then looking at the new paradigm. So with that concept in mind, in terms of the overview, we're going to look at then first, again, the new physics challenging the Newtonian universe. Now, again, I'm not a physicist. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not going to be going into the details of all of this because I don't understand the details and also the mathematics behind all of this, because this is really mathematical models. Okay. When I talked about the split of the atom in 1932 in the previous one, once we start kind of getting below the atom, it's difficult to really, quote unquote, see. It's difficult to say what is going on. We have to look at the effects and then theorize. So a lot of this is theory, but what it does, it challenges the rationality of the universe, which is the Newtonian universe. And I have up there relativity in the subatomic universe, Einstein's general theory of relativity in 1915, which I had already talked about in terms of, leading up to World War II. I'm going to come back to it just because, again, I'm not going to try to explain to you Einstein's general theory of relativity, special theory of relativity on the layman's terms, so to speak, or the layperson's non-specialist term is a little bit more easy to understand. But the general theory of relativity is more complex in some ways. But what it is doing is questioning the absolute concepts and constructs of time and of experience. I have up there the space-time and expanding universe. Einstein's general theory of relativity challenged Newton's understanding of the laws of the universe, including simply gravity. Because if everything is relative to a point in time and space, which was kind of the results of Newton's general theory of relativity, and you can say, well, how does that derive from E equals mc squared? I have no idea, but that's a little formula. Energy equals mass times a constant squared. It's not mechanical universe, and it's not really gravitational in that mechanical sense of a force acting on a body that whereby two bodies attract each other. That's what keeps us in the Newtonian world on the surface of the Earth, because the mass of the Earth is so great that the gravitational force it exerts on us is far greater than the gravitational force that we exert on the Earth. So the Earth draws us to itself. And that's why when we go to the moon or into space, there's less gravity because we're not as in quite close proximity. Now, for Newton, even, and then theoretical developments after Newton, gravity was the theory that explained how the galactic universe worked in terms of the relationship of bodies, stars, planets, individuals on those planets, at least planet Earth, and how it all works together. all of a sudden it was a linear mechanical universe. When we start observing things as telescopes developed, and as I said here, the subatomic particles started being observed when they break apart the atom, and obviously they're quote unquote real because they were put into use in the atomic bomb, the breaking up of the atom. Space seems to be curved, and what happened? What is these black holes, which actually Einstein's general theory of relativity predicted that there are masses out in the universe that are so dense, that nothing can escape from them. The so-called gravity is so strong that even light bends around them. That's why they're called black holes. It's not because they're nothing. It's not because they're holes. But all of a sudden, it's like time and space is a continuum. And gravity is not really a force between two bodies. It is simply a place within the space-time continuum. And then in 1929, and that is kind of from 1950 to throughout the 20s, more developments and refinements and everything. And actually, it's to say that Einstein's theories have been proved over and over again for the most part. Hubble, you might have heard of the Hubble telescope. It comes from this person's name. Forget his first name. Issued a theory, published a theory in 1929 of the universe expanding. So that all of a sudden, too, it's not simply a set universe with some outer boundary that then we can see within this context, but space itself is expanding. And that is, to me, an almost impossible concept to grasp, because we always would ask, expanding into what? And the point was, it's not expanding into anything. There's nothing outside of space in the universe, but we have an expanding universe. So all of a sudden, all the physical laws of Newton are being undermined and questioned. It's like, how can we understand? We thought we had things figured out. And then with the development of quantum mechanics in the 1920s, we have further undermining of this rational, mechanical, Newtonian universe. Because quantum mechanics deals with subatomic particles. And we keep finding more and more and more subatomic particles. But first, as I was taught in school growing up, we have the atom, and what's part of the atom? We have the nucleus consisting of protons and neutrons, and then we have electrons orbiting the nucleus, and that was the model of the atom. Which before the breakup, it was difficult to even grasp what that model could be, because the smallest unit was the atom. But once we split that apart, we see, oh, there's more things here. That keeps getting broken up further and further and further. Today we talk about quarks, the Higgs boson. I forget how many elementary particles there are, but there are a lot of them now. There had been one, the atom. Now there are multiple subatomic particles, because they can be further divided and divided and divided and divided and broken apart and see what they're all made of. What is a proton made up of? What is a neutron made up of? Electrons are pretty much set. But how do we understand how they all work? Do they work as Newton would have predicted? And the point is absolutely not. And in 1927, Werner Heisenberg, a German, because there's a lot also great German scientists of this period, many of whom then left Germany to come to the United States, published his uncertainty principle, or the indeterminacy principle. And what that meant is basically, when it comes down to it, in the non-scholar's sense or the non-physicist sense, is that when we look at subatomic particles, we cannot measure at the same time both the speed of a particle and its location. So that we have to choose. Do we try to measure its speed, or do we try to measure its location? Because subatomic particles, function just similarly to light. What is light? Is light a particle, or is it a wave? And there were experiments done, and you maybe have heard of these, I'm sure, some of them are very famous, of shooting a single photon. And a photon is a particle of light. Now, if you ask me, how do we know that and how can we shoot a single photon? I have no idea. To me, it makes, rationally, I understand the concept, but how it comes about, I don't know. Let's go the split screen experiment. I forgot when this was done, fairly early on. We have a screen with two splits, and you have like a photographic paper behind it. So if you shoot light, if you just shoot a lot of light, you'll see two splits on the photographic paper behind it. What happens if you just shoot one photon? The idea was it was going to go through one split or the other. It's like, okay, somehow the photon will have to choose which split to go on. But what turned out, and which was so astonishing, is a single photon, so a single particle of light, went through both splits. How is that possible? It's only possible because light, with photons and everything else, functions both as particles and as a wave. So a wave, like if you shoot the whole beam of light, the two splits, it's like a wave of light, two splits. If you shoot one photon, a particle, it still somehow has that wave function as it goes through the screen. Now, I can't explain how all that works, et cetera, but that doesn't make any sense in a Newtonian universe based on, atoms and particles and mechanics. That's why it's called quantum mechanics, because it doesn't adhere to the mechanics that work in our experiential world. Now, in so many ways, we still live in a Newtonian universe. We can still use Newton's laws of physics to describe the phenomena that we see and experience in general. It's only when we go into kind of outer space and the cosmos, etc., or into the subatomic particles. And then the whole question is, how do those two relate? Stephen Hawking, I hope you've heard of it. He died not too long ago. Was one of the most brilliant scientists of the 20th century, into the 21st century. And he's claimed that, what the task is now is to find a unified theory combining quote unquote gravity based on, relativity and time-space continuum with quantum mechanics. How do we put those all together? Because in the Newtonian universe, it all made sense and worked. But in the new universe or the new physics, it couldn't be really squared. How do we deal with quantum mechanics, which we're still trying to figure out? We're still finding more particles. How does that relate to time, space, curvature, and expansion? And Hawking said, if we can put those two theories together, that will explain everything. Now, he may be right, he may be wrong. But that was a challenge, and a complete challenge. And part of that, too, led to developments of theories for how things all kind of worked. And we have the development of what's called chaos theory in the course of the 1950s and 1960s, even though it goes back to the later 19th century in terms of some of the original discoveries that led to this theory of chaos. The theory of chaos essentially is that initial conditions affect outcomes. You may have heard the butterfly effect. It's like, okay, a butterfly in California flaps its wings, and that causes a tsunami in China. So that's ridiculous. But what it looks at is, if we start with a given condition, one very minor change can affect how it all works out. And something I call, as I'm writing, I think I mentioned I've been writing this work called On History. If I haven't, well, I'm writing this work on history, which is both a philosophical, kind of a philosophy of history. I refer to it as the chain of causation. So if we start looking at what causes what, we go back all the way to the beginning, so to speak. Really? How do you mean by that? Well, why am I lecturing right now? What is the cause of my lecturing right now? Well, I'm sitting here. I have a computer. I'm teaching this course. Why am I teaching this course? Because I'm a member of the university. I'm a faculty member, professor of history, and was assigned to teach this course. And then why was I that? Because the history department needs someone to teach it, and I've been taught it for a while, and that's where we're going. And why am I at this university in Indianapolis? Because that's where I got a job. Um, why wasn't I in the Netherlands? Because my first job was in the Netherlands. But how do we describe and explain my giving this lecture right now? There's like the immediate cause, but once we go beyond that, why am I even here? What caused me to be here? Well, in some ways, we can say my parents caused me to be here because they had me, so to speak. So, what caused my parents to have sexual intercourse at the particular time that they did? Because if a different sperm had fertilized a different egg, I would be different. I'd still be my mom and dad's son, but I would be different. I'd have a little different approach and everything else. Or if they'd had me a year earlier or a year later, how I developed would be very different. So that fact that they had intercourse at a particular time that led to a particular sperm and a particular egg being fertilized was a necessary cause for my being here. But what led to that? What led to their getting together? And it's pretty, it was pretty unlikely that they ever got together because they lived in two different, I mean, still in the same state, but two different places. My dad was on a farm in California, in Central California. My mom was in a little village, small town on the Central California coast. They were in different worlds, so to speak. How did they get together? What was the factors that led to their getting married and then having me? That's like, so all of a sudden, and then, but what led to their parents having them? And on it goes and on it goes and on it goes. And we go all the way back to say, well, either we go back to the moment of creation or to the Big Bang, whatever it started it all, 4.5 billion years ago, or whenever it was, is the cause why I am here right now lecturing to you. That is an example of the chaos. I refer to it as the chain of causations. Because if we start talking about explaining it, how do we really understand an event? How do we understand what is going on? What is the necessary level of causation that is required for us to say, oh, now I understand? I could go on about this for a long time, kind of as I do in my book on history. But that's the point we're talking about here. So this chaos is just, it's not that there is a rational, linear development. It is far more diverse. And there's a great book called Chaos for the popular audience. And one of the people that contributed to all this was a brilliant student and was at this think tank institute in New Mexico, not the Manhattan Project, but it was kind of like a successor of it. And he's trying to come up with something. And he was experimenting with, what's the effects of on human beings if we have, rather than a 24-hour day, if we have a 25-hour day. Obviously, there's a distinction between the physical aspects, but he said, the sun rises and sets at different times anyway. So, but we have demarcated this 24-hour period. In terms of the biorhythms, what if we do a 25-hour day, and how would that work out? And he was experimenting with himself. So he's up, 2 or 3 in the morning because of that change. He's out smoking a cigarette, and he's watching the smoke coming off of his cigarette. And it kind of goes up and whizzes, and then it kind of diffuses. What is that diffusion? What causes that diffusion for the smoke coming off of a cigarette or a can or anything else that's burning? All of a sudden, it seems to be a rational, logical path, and then it kind of breaks up into what? Chaos. Though you can't predict where it's going to go or what's going to happen. So this whole development of chaos theory was a theory to say there's something that we have to label to try to understand causation. And they're kind of then associated with that was something developed called fuzzy logic in 1965. Also with earlier predecessors, but really kind of being set in 1965, whereby it's like, okay, logic is binary. Your computer works on a binary system based on what I know of 0 to 1. Now, we have quantum computing now. That's where we're getting at in some ways, but especially originally, the original development of the computer was 0, 1, 0, 1, base 2 mathematics. And fuzzy logic is saying it's far more complex than that, because there's a whole almost infinite realm between 0 and 1. So it's not just an option between 0 and 1. It could be 0 0.1, 0 0.01, 0 0.0012, and all the infinite distance in terms of numbers and then therefore options between 0 and 1. So it's developed very complex mathematically. Maybe some of you understand it, could explain it to me, or to the class if you could. I've looked at the the explanations and the equations and stuff. It's like, okay, it was based on probability, and that's why it's fuzzy, because it's not set, but yet it works. And fuzzy logic is the basis for so much of modern technological development, based on quantum mechanics and the chaos theory, because we can't predict. That is really what a lot of this is getting at. We can't predict what's going to happen based on Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics doesn't work on the quantum level or on the cosmic level, even though for our daily lives it works just fine. But this has all caused this problem of, can there even be laws of nature? What does that mean for rationality and for who we are? And yet that questioning of who we are as these autonomous, rational individuals was likewise being questioned. In some ways, always has been. I pointed to Darwin, but then with Sigmund Freud, and Freud's challenging the autonomous, rational individual. You can say, "Oh my God, you're not going to talk about Freud, are you?" Yes, I am going to talk about Freud. You say, "Well, he's been discredited. No one, follows Freud anymore." That is a reduction. Is Freud important? To say, "Oh yes," because of the impact he had. We still talk about the ego. We still talk about egoism. There was no such thing as egoism before Freud. We talk about the unconscious, the subconscious. We talk about dreams. What does dreams mean? Dreams had always meant something. Visions and everything else. But Freud says dreams reflect the unconscious or the subconscious, kind of bubbling up. And some of his theories have had such a huge impact, even as other parts of his theories are not accepted or have to be radically changed. So in the terms of the development of modern psychology, you can't dismiss Freud. You don't have to agree with him. It's not an issue of a binary, 0 or 1. He is right or he is wrong. It is an aspect of looking at the impact he had, even if we don't follow Freudian psychoanalysis, which agreed there are very, very few pure Freudian psychoanalysts around. There are a few, but not very many. But what he opened up was that this whole dynamic of the mind or the psyche. And what is the psyche? The psyche is an English transliteration of the Greek psyche. The Greek psyche was translated into Latin as anima. Anima in Latin was translated into English as soul. Psychology is the investigation of the soul. It had been all along. Aristotle writes a treatise in Latin, De Anima, on the soul. But what it is psychology on the psyche. That's kind of what we're getting at. What is it comprised of? How does it work? How does our psyche work? And Freud had a huge impact on our understanding thereof. And here I have just the two different systems. We're talking about the Freudian archaeology, because he really said that the mind or the psyche is not a single thing, but there's an archaeological structure to it of two, let's say, threesomes: the conscious, unconscious, and subconscious, whereby we have our conscious mind, that which we're aware of. But underneath that conscious mind is the unconscious of things we're not aware of. things that have been repressed. And then we have the subconscious. And don't ask me, what's the difference between the unconscious and the subconscious? Because I could probably come up with something right now real quick to explain it, but it would not be accurate. And I would have to go back and look. Because my point is not that. I'm not going to be saying, oh, explain in Freudian terms the relationship between the subconscious and the unconscious. My point is that there are various regions, that's why it's called archaeology, um, of our mind that affects our consciousness, but is not themselves conscious. So all of a sudden, it's like, is that rational? If I do something, if I go and let's say right now, all of a sudden, let's say I'm sitting here right now and I'm lecturing, and all of a sudden I'm going to do something disgusting. I start picking my nose. Okay, is that a rational discussion? Now, I'm on video. I can see myself, so I'm not going to start doing that. But let's say I'm lecturing in class, and let's say I'm not even aware, and I start, picking my nose. That's not a conscious decision. Those are all these factors. Now we can say, okay, yeah, for Freud, this all goes back to infantile sexuality and the traumas that we had as children dealing with our sexuality. So that's been dismissed. But if you've had, I don't know how many of you have children or have had children or want to have children. If you have children, it's hard to dispute that there is a childhood infantile sexuality. It's based on the erotic zones of pleasure. It's not sexuality of, oh, hey, I want you. But it's an issue of what brings me pleasure. And we don't like to think of children as, and especially babies and infants, as sexual beings. That's a much later development. But we have to understand what Freud was coming from. He's looking at how are these developments, how is it that we socialize infants? And that gets to be the other than tripartite archaeology of Freud is the id, the ego, and the superego. And that too is an issue of conflict because the ego is the conscious self. The id is this issue of desire of I want. Oh yeah, everything me. That's the id. Anything I want and desire. Id, it. These are all Latin terms, by the way. The superego is that kind of parental function of no, you can't have that. So the ego is in conflict with the superego and the id because the id is pulling on it, the superego is kind of coming down on it. How do we function? Again, our consciousness is ego, but these other aspects are there. How do we deal with it? And what it means is that the individual is not this autonomous, rational individual, even though we can be rational and we can act rationally and we can reason, but that's just our conscious mind. And to what extent is our conscious reason and reasoning affected by our unconscious forces of the id and the superego? How does that really deal with the motivations of human action? Are human actions always rational based on the autonomous rational individual, or are there other factors working in addition to it? And this Freudian insight has shaped modern philosophy, regardless of whether you accept his views of infantile sexuality, his Oedipal theory, and things like that. It is like, okay, what does that mean for how I conceive of myself? Who am I after all? How do I think of myself? Am I just my ego, or are there other factors involved that I'm not even aware of, I'm not conscious of? The influence, if not determine, what I do, what I think, how I act, and interact with people. So that is kind of this challenge of the modern paradigm of the rational enlightenment individual is kind of being broken apart. And when we add that with Freud, we have the whole problem of what does it mean to be human? And with the rise of atheism, how do we relate all of this? Because are we really unique creatures of God who created us as individuals, who loves us individually? Or are we animals that have developed and evolved in a particular way that we're not even aware of? That's still a question we're dealing with. The understanding of self. Who are we as individuals and as people? Undermining the modern paradigm. Then we have the global village, challenging the nation state. Now, we say there's a lot about globalism. You have some people being all for globalism, some people seeing it as a danger. No. We have to get away from the global context. We need to focus on America first or whatever. So it's a competing concept to nationalism. Nationalism being the model of modernity and somewhat early modernity as it's developing, the nation state. Globalism is not based on the nation state, and the term global village was coined by Marshall McLuhan in 1962 in his famous book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, which focused on media. Media. Television, telegraph. This is before email. But what he argued was that based on the media, we are really in a global village because we can communicate anywhere in the world almost instantaneously. Before the development of these technologies, the telegraph, the telephone, the television, you have to send a letter. It would take a long time. And I think I mentioned the issue of the telegraph and the importance of it in World War I. Just that length of time between sending a letter and then someone receiving it in a different part of the world, or even within, my gosh, how long would it take to get a letter from Indianapolis to New York? Even today, it takes a little while. Whereas a telephone call is almost immediate, email now is almost immediate. Social media is out there. And I'll be talking about the information technology revolution in one of the last lectures. So it has gone even far beyond McLuhan's The Gutenberg Galaxy, but also with print, with Gutenberg, because print starts that mass media. That's what we call it, the Gutenberg Galaxy. Now, that global village concept has developed, or did develop, into other concepts. Are we really a global village? How are we working together? And doesn't that then undermine or call into question the whole construct of the nation state as the political entity that we identify with? Or do we identify with a global village and a global society? And how does globalism fit in with the emerging Cold War? And in 1962, we are in the midst of the Cold War. I'll be talking more about the Cold War in the next lecture. So if you look at the Cold War, this emergence of two superpowers, which I've already talked about before the midterm, in the aftermath of World War II, the U.S. and the USSR. So that's not globalism. But in some ways, the world was divided between these two realms of influences, the USSR and the USA. Ideologically, we'll see more of that, how all that played out. Structurally, we've already pointed to the influence of their playing out in the problems of the Middle East. I'll be talking more about that next lecture too. So it's globalism, but just like in medieval Christendom, it was not a univocal. It wasn't like everybody got along. It wasn't like the Pope and the Emperor were just buddies. It's still here we have this global village of international worldwide communication that is linking us all together, even though there are two primary ideologies or myths or paradigms within, let's say, sub-paradigms within the overall paradigm of we're all interconnected. How do we deal with these two superpowers? And it is the conflict within a global context something that we can learn how to deal with, because that conflict almost destroyed the world as we know it. And that's two I'll be talking about next lecture. So globalism is not let's everybody get together, hold hands, and sing Kumbaya and buy each other a Coke, and we'll all be fine in one great big happy global village. That's not what it's about at all. It's about how our means of communication and interconnections, how do they function within a global context, whether it's the global economy, global government, or what have you. How do we understand this new emerging globalism of the global village, which is a metaphor? It's not this the qualitative thing, as I said, if we all get along, but it wouldn't be great if we could. But it is looking at how these entities interact. The nation state all of a sudden is not simply an independent entity, but it's part of this global structure. How do we do it? Which is different from here's a nation state, here's a nation state, here's a nation state. How do we look at kind of like the atomic parts? The global village concept is, but these are all connected. As part of the whole kind of thing is the global village. And what are the structures and the dynamics thereof? Now, we have the rise of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and multinational corporations. Because the global economy was developing, and from this point on developed even further, whereby the banking system changed. I don't know if you remember this. Some of you don't because you're too young probably, but when I was growing up, there was no such thing in the United States as interstate banking. If you moved to another state, you had to get a new bank. Yes, there were means of getting money to different places and transferring money overseas and things, but it was very complex. When you went to Europe, you got traveler's checks. There weren't ATMs anywhere. And you had to exchange your currency repeatedly and often. I'll be talking more about that. And not next week, not next lecture, but I think next week we'll talk about the European Union. It's also an economic aspect with the introduction of the euro. So it was a very different world economically, also for business, international business. Now, there was trade. There's always been trade. But what we're talking about here is somehow this world, going back to Manuel Wallerstein, the world system in the 16th century, it is this whole global context of international banking, international commerce, and corporations that are sitting on top of a network that are not necessarily related to the nation state. They have their own vested interests, namely to make money for their shareholders, for their CEOs, and everything else. And there becomes a disjunction between these NGOs, non-governmental institutions, and multinational corporations, and then the national governmental interactions. Do they really serve the same purposes? Do they have the same goals? Exxon is a great example. Exxon, it's not just when you go to the gas station and get it. It's not just when you buy stock in Exxon. There was a reason Trump appointed, what's the guy's name? Tillerson, as Secretary of State, because he had been the CEO of Exxon, one of the largest corporations in the world. And Exxon was doing business with Russia. Exxon was doing business over here and over here, because the issue for Exxon was what is good for Exxon, this international corporation, not what is good for the United States. Exxon started as Standard Oil. Standard Oil, I think it was Standard Oil of New York when it got then broken up. It was New Jersey. Anyway, I think Mobil was New York and Exxon was New Jersey. Anyway, let's go back to J.D. Rockefeller, the early 20th century, breaking up of the monopoly. But then it becomes this humongous megalith of entities, and it's not based on the concept of the nation state. And just think of the influence these huge non-governmental institutions, multinational corporations have. And here I'll be talking more about this too again in the next in the lecture on the information technology and the technological information revolution. Facebook, Google, whatever other things. This perhaps is the biggest example of one of these things. These are not government companies. These are private companies that function nationwide, and think of the impact that they're having. We are talking about that. How do we do? Do we have to regulate these? What do we do? How do we deal with the relationship between these international, multinational, non-governmental corporations of Google and Facebook and Meta or whatever it is now, and all the others, because are they undermining the national interest? Are they really good for society? And obviously, there's been some benefit, but what? How do we weigh the relative benefit to detriment? And what does it really mean for the nation state? And that's just, I use that just because there's a lot of discussion about that now, as I'm assuming you know. But as the example of what I'm talking about, these non governmental organizations that are in some ways ruling the world and global politics. Whether it's these corporations that are, Exxon and the like, or whether it's the social media companies, etc. Think of the power they have. Think of the power they have. And so, in one way, what is really fueling international politics within the context of the global village? Is it the nation state? Or is it these multinational corporations with the money to determine, okay, let's see, governments, you think you're regulating us, but we are actually playing you off for our own benefit. There's a book that came out in the 80s, I think it was, called Empire. It was written by a couple of people. I should have, I have it, I've read it several times. I even assigned it once when I taught this class way back when. Who were both communists. We can almost say that they are neo-communists because they are not communists in the vein of the Stalin, Lenin, Soviet, or China of Mao Zedong. And so, and they are looking at the developments of the second half of the 20th century and on, these rise of the multinational corporations. And they're saying this is really a phase we need to go through, especially after the 80s and Reaganism. We'll be talking about that when we get there. Because the nation state is really no longer the focus of power. The nation state is increasingly pawns to these NGOs who are determining how things work. And they talked about the emerging new empire. They said it's amazing because for the first time ever in history, an empire is being established that is not based on a nation state, that is not based on a state. Where we go back all the way to Sargon as the first empire, Sargon's empire in the Middle East, to eventually then Rome. If we're talking about the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, we can talk about the American Empire, sort of, even though we never really have labeled it that, and that kind of lags behind. We talk about the Russian Empire, Peter the Great, which Putin wants to reestablish. We can talk about the Soviet Union, and they're saying all of a sudden who is pulling the strings, the real power, is not based on the nation state. It's these non-governmental institutions that are establishing and forming an empire. And it's a stage that we have to go through, kind of like with Marx, almost kind of more classically Marxian, saying with Marx, the bourgeois revolution is necessary before the proletarian revolution can take place, and the proletarian revolution can only take place as a natural process when the proletariat comes to its own class consciousness. And then what happened? Lenin and Stalin say, no, we're going to enforce that. For Marx, it's an interpretation of historical development. And this book, Empire, which again, maybe I'll post it, at least the reference for you. They argue that what is going on now with this empire, the emerging empire of NGOs, mega corporations, is a completely new model based on profit, based on money, wherever money can be made, not based on national interests. And it's a necessary stage to go to before we can get to that final overthrow where we have the classless society. Now, I'm not advocating that their interpretation is the correct one. I'm not trying to say here, and I'm here to reveal to you the truth of the matter, and that is that we should all be communists to bring about the ultimate class society once we get through this stage of these, go beyond the nation state, beyond the NGOs to some classless society of utopia. I'm not arguing for that at all. But my point is they put their finger on something I think very important, is that nation state is dwindling in its importance. It's dwindling in its influence because the nation states are dependent upon and subservient to these massive international corporations, NGOs, and non-governmental organizations, which are pulling the string. Davos is a great example of that. If you don't know about Davos, that's where the big, mega wealthy people go to sit and talk about making plans for the world. Governmental leaders go there too to find out what the top 0.5% or whatever are trying to devise. How are we going to deal with policy here? That is kind of what this is all about. Are we going into a phase where the nation state is no longer the basis of political organization for society? And what do we do about it? Isn't this a new postmodern world? That's the challenge to the nation state. Now, I know I'm running out of time here. I just wanted to say a couple of things more than philosophy. I thought when I was looking at this lecture, I thought this is probably going to be the time when I spend the most time on because I know a bit more about it. But in philosophical developments and thoughts, a postmodern perspective is often related to or identified with Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. 20th century philosophers. Derrida dies in 2004. Foucault, I think, died in 1988 or something like that. And what they start doing is analyzing. They're not the first, but there's others certainly involved in all of this. Kind of also this postmodern, post-structuralist. They start questioning and challenging language itself, because language is a system of signs. Okay, language is not things themselves; it's things that signify things. So, what is the relationship between a sign and what it signifies, and how do we make that relationship? Focusing on the text itself, what is the meaning of meaning? Now, in the modern paradigm of Enlightenment paradigm of rationality, these things weren't questioned. Language has always been a problem. In some ways, St. Augustine back in the day pointed to the problems of sign and the signifier, and how do we relate those two? And what does the term God mean? As an example, does it signify the same thing? Well, if I say it, I know what it signifies to me, but is that different than when you say it and what it means to you? And then we're arguing about different things, even though we're using the same terms. It gets very complex. And I wish I had more time, so I'm trying to rush through this, but I want to give you the essence of what's going on here, so that we have the emergence of discourse and marginality with Foucault, looking at texts and discourses and basically saying, is there such a thing before there's the language and discourse to describe it? In his book, Madness and Civilization, when did madness arise? It's not an issue of people being, quote unquote, crazy or having mental problems, but as a concept, madness and the mental institution as a historical development when we start talking about it. When we start talking about it, that's when things emerge. What is the Reformation? The Reformation is not a thing, it's a discourse. What's the fall of the Roman Empire? It's a metaphor. It's not like the Roman Empire is here. Here's the Roman Empire. Oh my gosh, it fell. It is language. It's historiography. It's language, but then we take the language or the sign and we say that is the same as the signifier. And they're saying, no, it's not, it's not, it's not. And Derrida comes along and says there's nothing outside the text, because text is language. We think in language. Now, babies think before they have language. How do babies think? I have no idea. If you look at a little baby, if you have kids, they are processing. They're like mega processors. They can communicate by crying and this and pointing and everything else. They don't have language. They have to develop language. And once we develop language, we can't go back to that pre-lingual understanding of how we thought. That's why Derrida said there's nothing outside the text, because everything is text. Every thought we have, even if we don't write it down or type it on the computer, what we think with language. And language is the text. And then the problem is a text, how does it work? How does it function? What are the boundaries of a given text? Can we understand the meaning of an individual text without understanding the meaning of all those other texts involved as well? And in the mental space, so let's just say, I write, I love history. Very clear. If I say I love history, I'm assuming every one of you knows what I mean. But really, what does it mean? Because it's not just the language. What does it mean to me? And first of all, that was a text in my head, a mental text that then I write down. So there's the discrepancy between what's in my head and what I write down. That's what I've talked about too in terms of your exams, which is just, I'm not trying to be postmodern or Derridian here in any way, shape, or form. But the point is just there's always a difference between what we think is in our heads and what we write necessarily. And we have to see, how does that really work? And does what I write, does that signify to me what I have in my head? It's one thing, but does it signify to somebody else what I want it to signify? So that, again, the text is all we have. So what does it mean? I love history. Well, you have to say, okay, that's a thought in my head. I love history, but where does that come from? What is it connected with other thoughts? And this is where we go back to a Freudian, in a general sense, understanding the psyche, because how did that text come about? How can we explain that text that I composed in my head, I love history, that I then wrote, that you all understand, but do you really? Can you explain it? How did it come into my mind? That it gets into the whole problem then of who am I and all the different influences, and on we go. So it's really a disintegration of meaning, or at least a disintegration of what we all thought was meaning based on the Enlightenment paradigm, the modern paradigm of meaning being clear because we can read it, we can see it, and we know what the way the world works. So all of a sudden, even language becomes challenged because we can't escape language. I mean, I could say a lot about this, but I know I'm already getting close to being out of time for this lecture. But to make it very, I'll try to make this as quickly as possible. When I was at Liverpool Hope University, chair of the Department of Theology, Philosophy, and Religious Studies, 2010, 2011, or 2012, there was a conference on translation of the Bible. Right? Translation is always a problem because you can't really translate. There's some things you just can't translate. It was not my thing, but I was asked, since I was head of the department, to give a kind of a welcoming address to everybody who was there, all these great scholars of biblical translation, and so in various languages. And I got up and said how much I hate language. I said, I wish we could just all grunt. Some ways it would make life easier and clearer, because if I, and that's that prelingual baby aspect, if I could just grunt for things, that's almost more effective communication than like, I really wish you would let me do X, Y, and Z. Or would you mind if could I ask you for that? That becomes all mixed up in culture and language and everything else. Now, that was a big shock in some ways that I said that, but then I went on to say, because language is the mystery. The fact that we can communicate at all is a mystery. How does it happen? I won't go into, because that was then a theological argument that I was making at the time to make it about people go, whoa, oh, that's cool. But the point being here is that language is indeterminate. And finding out what it means is, if we look up in the dictionary, but how are dictionaries formed? Scholars get together and look at how words are used and have been used. It's not like there's some perfect, God who is writing it. This is the meaning of this word. That's why we have various definitions for a single term. It's all kind of politically, philosophically, intellectually, culturally determined. How do we get beyond that? And what do things mean? It's not a problem if we say, what does it mean to me? But once we go, what does it mean to me? But what does it mean? Is there any meaning? That's the problem with the question. And that was what was always assumed within the modern paradigm coming out of the Enlightenment, that meaning was clear and could be communicated, and there wasn't really a problem about it. But all of a sudden, language, you have to translate. We knew the problems of translation. So all know the problems of translation. But the fact that, what? what we think is meaning is not really the meaning. So we're all just creating things in our heads. Is that what's going on? And so this whole issue of language in postmodernism, with terms of Foucault and Derrida, undermined meaning and what it is that we're seeing and describing and discussing. And that then was paralleled too by developments in art. So we see here art and representation. What are we representing, whether it be with language or in art? And what is the function of art? Now, I'm not an art historian, and I'm not going to go into all these things very much, but just going through some of the developments. Okay, we just kind of start out with realism, and realism goes back, we say, all the way to the 16th century, if not before. But that gets into the whole thing of Renaissance. We talk about the emergence of realism in Renaissance art and perspective, the development of perspective, and then we go. But became really the style of modernity, where art was seen to reflect that which was seen and observed, very much like a photograph, even though the still lifes paintings of the 17th century were before photography, and they looked like exactly like it is. But realism, here's a picture of a realist painting. And this was done in 1941 by Peter Monster. But this is what I mean by realism. Here's a beautiful, idyllic scene, right? We see it like you can just imagine being there and painting what he saw. It's a beautiful country scene with the river or this creek or whatever it is over with the trees hanging over. That's a realism of its representation. And that led to then the development, and this is a very late example of realism. Okay, realism is long too, so I'm not just saying. To Impressionism, and here is one of Claude Monet's water lilies. He painted so many different paintings of water lilies, and Claude Monet was one of the major factors in the emergence of Impressionism as an artistic movement, and this was done in 1926, where he's not trying to say, oh, this is what I see, and I'm representing what I am looking at. I am representing my insight and understanding of what I'm looking at. So I'm not trying to realistically depict a scene with water lilies. I'm trying to reveal how I see it and what it means to me and how I conceive of it in my own mind. And here it is. This is my impression. This is my impression of what I am observing. It's not my attempt to depict what I see. That developed then even further. And this then is Pablo Picasso, 1973, into what's known as Cubism. Based on Picasso. He's not the only one, but he's kind of the founder of it. And here we see a portrait. I think it may even be a self-portrait. I'm not sure. But it's a portrait. That's not a realistic portrait. That's not even an impressionistic portrait. That is, I am doing something with this. So what I see, if I have a model, whether it's myself or someone posing for the model, I'm not depicting in my painting my impression. I'm not giving a realistic. I am messing with it. And so I am going to use cubes to kind of construct this thing that is not real, but it is somehow trying to get at something, some reality of a portrait that we are just blocks put together. I'm not sure. As I said, I'm not a Picasso scholar. I'm not even an art historian. So I can't talk about, the whole basis of the development and origins of Cubism and Picasso and what he was trying actually to do. But it is still another step away from Impressionism. And then once we get that, we are leaving the realm of reality altogether, and we have then the emergence of Surrealism. And here I have then the next picture is Salvador Dali, who dies in 1989. Spanish, as with Picasso. Now you can say, on the one hand, this looks more like a realistic painting, but it's completely unreal. It's called surrealism. Putting things together. It's not impressionism. It is kind of playing in one's mind, thinking, how can we undermine reality? How can we undermine reality? Whereas kind of impressionism is an impression of reality, cubism is a construct of reality, kind of questioning what we see and observe. Surrealism says, let's get rid of reality because there's no really such thing and look at what we see. Now, I'm going to show you another picture which you may recognize because this too was nothing, let's say, as such new in the 20th century with Dali or the other surrealist artists. Because this next slide and picture is about as surreal as you can get. Just look at that for a minute. And this is a painting that was painted by Hieronymus Bosch, who died in 1516. This is from, I believe, his Last Judgment. It's like, the guy must have been on drugs. It's the only thing I can come up with. And maybe Dali was too. I wouldn't be surprised. Because this goes beyond imagination in some ways. But Hieronymus Bosch was completely a surrealist because this is no kind of representation of reality. Just look at it for a minute. That's 1516. So the phenomena of surrealism was around. And somehow surrealism, very much in this Foucauldian sense, way before Foucault, was designed to go to the extreme to show the surrealistic representation, to question and to interpret the realism that we experience. And so, like Foucault, I didn't get the chance to talk about this, talked about the margins of society. If we want to really know what a society or culture is like, we have to look at the margins, the marginalities, because that will really reveal what a society is like, not the center. And this is like the surrealistic representation really reveals the, let's say, perversity and absurdity of the world that we experience. This whole surrealistic position is not about representing what we see, but representing a concept. And that led to the idea of art as not being depiction or representation, but being conceptual. And here I have a piece, and I'm not sure where this was, I forgot to note down who did this and what, but it's not surrealistic. It's conceptual, trying to say something by means of depicting of something that really is kind of weird. If you see a tree branch there with a faucet attached to it, and then plants coming out or weeds coming out, that gets at life, something living, then a faucet, and then life coming out. Now, I'm not saying that's the proper interpretation of this, but the whole point is that there's some really weird conceptual artwork we have on campus and everything else. A lot of contemporary art is conceptual art. So it's not attempting to depict anything that is observed, except a concept in the artist's head. How do you communicate something that is in your head? And you can do that either with text or with artistic production. That is what is going on. So we're moving away from interpreting quote unquote reality that we see and experience to what's in our head and how do we bring that and communicate that. Which too is undermining the Enlightenment modern paradigm of what is real and how do we deal with it and how do we describe it. Now, that kind of wraps it up in a nutshell, so to speak. And as I talked about at the beginning, we're really looking at various ways that we've seen that this modern paradigm of the Enlightenment ideals of the autonomous individual and rationality of the nation state, based on capitalism and industrialization, etc., has been undermined and picked away at. And so as we are moving from, as that is happening, as we're moving from modernity and rationality and Newtonian physics to quantum mechanics and curved time-space relativity and all the other aspects that we've talked about, that I've talked about today, we also find a reaction against it. A romantic here because romanticism is kind of holding on to an ideal. And what we have is this reaction to the developments that are questioning the modern paradigm, and that is a reaction of fear of postmodernity and tries to go back to hold on to things that made sense. Talking about a crisis being when the world no longer makes sense to us. The way we assumed things worked are being undermined. And postmodernity, in this broad context, undermined the way the world worked in the modern paradigm. And so if you're brought up and think about that in terms of postmodernity and modernism, there's a reaction of, I don't want this because I don't understand it. It's scary. It's not the way things are. So there's this reactionary movement to saying no. as then, let's say the conservative view. I don't mean the Republicans right here, but just the conservative view is this romantic reactionary to what is going on. And then let's say, quote unquote, the liberal view is let's change and forge ahead into the new paradigm, whatever it might be. And these two conflict as they always have. And we see that at various stages. That's why I say this is not a political discussion right now in terms of Republicans and Democrats today, even though I think it applies. We can see that with the Reformation and the Roman Catholic Church as it emerged was that reactionary, romantic reaction. So there is that reactionary that all the way through. And with modernity, the emergence of modernity, there is that reaction because what that was a revolutions, various revolutions brought Western civilization from kind of this early modern paradigm into the modern paradigm. And there's always reactions against revolutions. How do we understand this and what's going on now in our world in terms of as we're moving towards this new paradigm, which we don't even have a term for except for postmodern, because the postmodern Enlightenment rationale no longer really works. What do we do with this? Where do we go with it? And there's that sense of no, we don't want this because it's scary. We don't understand it. We want to hold on to what we know. Whereas others are like, let's go blindly into the future. How do we deal with these two extremes? Where do we go from here? And I don't have any question or any answers to that. I just have a lot of questions. But when we look at the historical development of Western civilization, we at least put those issues into the context of what was going on and what has been going on and what is going on now. So we see that what is going on now has a lot of historical developments. It doesn't come from nothing. What do we do about it? That's not for the historian to say. Can we help understanding what it is that we're dealing with and what we're experiencing? I certainly hope so. Otherwise, I would not be teaching this course. Okay. That's the broad scheme. Now, we're going to be looking at individual parts of that as we go through the rest of the course of this changing paradigm from modernity into whatever it might be. Where do we go from here? This lecture was a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, so my apologies. And even though I had to rush through some things, I'll try to make up for that in the next lecture. Even though I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that, but I'll try. All right. Thank you very much for your patience. And we'll are rushing towards the end of the course and your final exam, which we'll be talking more about as well. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.